There are revenge plots. And then there are the kinds of revenge plots that do not merely aim to hurt a man, but to erase him slowly, piece by piece, until even the people who love him no longer recognize what remains. That is the darkness now circling Nick. What makes this chapter so disturbing is not simply that he is in danger, but that the danger has been designed with patience, with cruelty, and with a deeply personal understanding of where his weaknesses live. Matt is no longer acting like a desperate enemy lashing out in a moment of rage. He is behaving like a man who has turned resentment into discipline, like someone who has spent far too much time studying the emotional anatomy of his target and has finally found the most merciless way to break him. And the most terrifying part is that he does not want Nick dead too quickly. He wants him ruined. He wants him degraded. He wants him stripped of self-respect, strength, credibility, and hope, until the man who once carried so much responsibility becomes a cautionary spectacle of collapse. That is why this story feels so explosive. Matt is not pursuing a clean victory. He is waging psychological war. He has identified addiction not merely as a physical vulnerability, but as a weapon that can poison every layer of Nick's life at once. It can corrupt memory, judgment, trust, dignity, and family loyalty in one brutal sweep. It can turn pain into dependency and then dependency into shame. Matt understands that very well, which is precisely why his vengeance is so horrifying. He wants Nick conscious enough to feel disgrace, weak enough to lose control, and trapped enough to understand that every effort to fight back may only sink him deeper. This is not just assault. It is humiliation as strategy. It is domination disguised as inevitability. And in that poisonous logic lies the true horror of Matt's plan. He wants Nick to participate in his own destruction, even if that participation is coerced, manipulated, and born from agony. Nick's ordeal becomes even more painful because he is not a man easily separated from his sense of duty. He has spent too much of his life trying to be the steady one, the reliable one, the person who takes the impact and still remains standing for everyone else. That kind of identity can be a source of strength, but it can also become a trap when someone figures out how to turn it against you. Nick has always endured pressure by convincing himself that he can outlast it, absorb it, manage it, and protect others from the fallout. But Matt's cruelty is engineered to make endurance itself feel useless. Every passing hour under his control threatens to transform resilience into torment. Nick is being pushed toward a point where survival is no longer noble but humiliating, where every breath comes with the possibility of further degradation, where the body itself becomes a battlefield he may be too exhausted to defend. That inner collapse matters, because Nick's worst pain would never come only from physical suffering. It would come from the realization that he is becoming vulnerable in ways he cannot hide. Somewhere beneath the drugged haze, beneath the pounding confusion, and the sickening sensation that his own system is betraying him, Nick still knows what is happening. He knows that Matt is trying to drag him downward not only into weakness, but into a version of himself he would despise. That awareness burns. It infects every attempt to stay grounded. Nick does not just fear dying. He fears what he might become before rescue ever arrives. He fears the possibility that when this is over, the people who come for him will not find the strong, angry, unbroken man they expected, but someone hollowed out by chemical dependence and stripped of his moral footing. That fear feeds the shame. The shame feeds the panic. And the panic becomes another opening for Matt to exploit. Matt, for his part, is not driven by simple malice. That would almost be easier to understand. What drives him is a warped need to prove something, both to Nick and to himself. In Matt's mind, pain must be balanced through ruin. He has convinced himself that Nick deserves not just punishment, but unraveling. He wants to demonstrate that all the things Nick represents, stability, family loyalty, masculine control, moral endurance, are thinner and more fragile than anyone around him ever wanted to admit. Matt is not content to injure Nick because injury heals. He wants to expose him. He wants to force the world to see Nick not as a protector, but as a man who can be corrupted, injected, manipulated, and reduced. There is almost a theatrical vanity to the way Matt operates now. He does not merely want revenge. He wants authorship. He wants to write Nick's fall with his own hands and then stand back and admire the wreckage. That impulse reveals a great deal about Matt's own broken psychology. Men like him rarely seek destruction, without also seeking validation. He wants to believe that his grievances have elevated him above ordinary cruelty, that he is enacting some brutal form of justice rather than indulging obsession. But beneath all of that false righteousness lives insecurity. Matt needs Nick destroyed because Nick's existence offends him. Nick represents the kind of grounded strength Matt cannot possess naturally. Even when flawed, even when burdened, Nick carries a kind of emotional legitimacy that Matt has never been able to command. And envy, when it festers long enough, stops wanting equality. It wants contamination. It wants to drag the admired figure into filth so that admiration itself becomes impossible. That is why Matt is fixated on addiction as a method. If Nick falls that way, then the fall looks personal, dirty, and irreversible. It no longer resembles tragedy. It begins to resemble weakness. That distortion is exactly what Matt craves. Yet Nick is not yielding easily, and that resistance becomes one of the most powerful emotional engines in the story. Even as his body weakens, even as his thoughts blur, and every moment becomes more difficult to control, some core part of him refuses the role Matt has written. His resistance is not loud, heroic, or glamorous. It is painful, stubborn, and deeply human. It lives in the fragments of self-command he can still summon, in the moments when memory cuts through fog, in the desperate effort to hold on to names, faces, and obligations. Nick keeps reaching mentally toward the people who define him. Family becomes an anchor. Responsibility becomes an anchor. Rage becomes an anchor. The very things Matt wants to poison become the things Nick clings to in order not to disappear. But that only intensifies the agony, because each memory also reminds him of what is at stake. He can picture the faces of the people who would suffer if he never returns whole. He can imagine the horror that would spread through his family if they found him too late. He can feel the humiliation of being remembered not for what he survived, but for how completely he was brought down. That emotional torment turns the story into more than a kidnapping or a revenge plot. It becomes a brutal examination of how identity holds under sustained violation. Nick has always been the kind of man who makes difficult choices with his eyes open, even when those choices cost him personally. But here he is denied the dignity of clean decisions. He is being dragged into a state where choices are blurred, instincts are compromised, and control over his own body is no longer secure. That is one of the cruelest aspects of Matt's plan. He is not simply taking Nick hostage, he is robbing him of authorship over himself. And for a man who has spent years trying to maintain order amid chaos, that is a torment far beyond physical pain. Meanwhile, the world outside continues to move, and that contrast sharpens the tragedy. Somewhere beyond the walls of Matt's cruelty, life carries on with all its routines, obligations, and appearances. But emotionally, a storm is building around Nick even before anyone sees the full extent of what has been done to him. The people closest to him would feel that absence like a wrongness in the air, a deepening tension they cannot ignore. His disappearance would not register as a simple inconvenience. It would feel like a warning. And with every passing moment, the fear surrounding him would begin to change shape. At first, there would be hope that he could be found quickly, that the situation was manageable, that the threat had limits. But as time stretches and information remains scarce, hope would curdle into dread. That dread would force difficult questions into the open. Who failed to see the danger soon enough? Who underestimated Matt? Who should have acted earlier? Who is now willing to go too far in order to bring Nick back? That last question is where the larger conflict becomes truly combustible. Because when someone like Nick is being targeted with this level of malice, rescue itself becomes morally complicated. People who love him may begin crossing lines they once swore they would never cross. Old resentments can resurface. Buried blame can rise. Private guilt can turn into reckless determination. Matt's plan, whether he fully admits it or not, depends on that wider fallout. He is not only hurting Nick, he is destabilizing every bond connected to him. He is forcing other people to confront what they are willing to do when the victim is someone central, someone loved, someone whose suffering feels like an insult to the entire emotional order around them. That is how revenge multiplies its damage. It spreads beyond the immediate victim and turns everyone nearby into potential accomplices to further chaos. And at the center of that chaos is Nick's own anger, which remains vitally important because anger is one of the few weapons still left to him. Not blind rage, not pointless fury, but the cold, bitter anger of a man who understands exactly how deeply he is being violated. That anger helps preserve his sense of self. It reminds him that he is not consenting to this destruction, not surrendering to it, not accepting Matt's script as final. Yet anger also has a darker edge. Under enough pressure, it can transform from survival into desperation. Nick may begin to think less about getting out intact, and more about making Matt pay, less about recovery, and more about retaliation. That shift would be dangerous, because it mirrors the very poison Matt lives by, but it would also be heartbreakingly understandable. When a person is pushed hard enough, vengeance starts to feel like the only language cruelty respects. Matt likely understands that too, which is why he keeps tightening the screws. He wants Nick enraged. He wants him desperate. He wants him unstable enough that if escape or rescue comes, Nick is already psychologically scorched. In Matt's ideal outcome, even survival would not look like victory. It would look like damage. It would leave scars that keep doing his work long after the immediate crisis ends. Addiction, once weaponized, does not stop at the moment the drugs stop. It leaves behind memory, craving, fear, shame, and suspicion. Matt is aiming for that long tail of suffering. He wants a future where Nick is haunted by what was done to him, where his family is haunted too, where every moment of weakness or emotional withdrawal can be traced back to the nightmare Matt engineered. This is revenge with afterlife. Revenge designed not just for impact, but for echo. And that is what makes Nick's fight so emotionally rich. He is not merely battling for escape. He is battling for the right to remain himself after enduring something meant to erase him. He is fighting against contamination, against degradation, against the possibility that the worst thing Matt does is not what enters his bloodstream but what enters his mind. Every time Nick senses his own thoughts slipping, every time exhaustion threatens to flatten his resistance, the battle grows more intimate and more terrifying. He has to decide, again and again, whether there is enough of him left to keep resisting. He has to choose survival even when survival begins to feel ugly. He has to keep believing that being found is still possible, that coming back is still possible, that Matt's vision of his ruin is not the final truth. What elevates this story beyond simple suspense is the way it forces everyone into hard emotional territory. Nick is stripped down to endurance. Matt is consumed by obsession masquerading as justice. The people searching for Nick, or soon preparing to search for him, are pushed toward ethically dangerous choices because the more they understand the nature of Matt's revenge, the less patience they will have for restraint. This is exactly where soap drama becomes most powerful, when pain does not remain abstract, when every decision reveals something ugly and honest about the people making it. Nick's vulnerability exposes how much pride has always been tied to his role as protector. Matt's cruelty exposes how revenge can become a personality, a worldview, an addiction of its own. And those around them will be exposed too, because love under pressure rarely remains pure. It becomes possessive, desperate, punishing, and sometimes frighteningly strategic. There is also a devastating irony running underneath all of this. Matt wants Nick to be consumed by addiction, but Matt himself is already addicted to destruction. He is dependent on the spectacle of collapse. He needs suffering to feel powerful. He needs Nick's deterioration the way another man might need validation, affection, or forgiveness. In that sense, Matt is not acting from strength at all. He is acting from the bottomless hunger of a man who has built his identity around revenge because without revenge, he would have to face his own emptiness. That does not make him less dangerous. It makes him more dangerous. Because men who are secretly hollow often try hardest to carve hollowness into others. Nick may come to understand that before anyone else does. In the midst of fear and chemical torment, he may begin to see that Matt's true vulnerability is not physical but psychological. Matt needs control because without it he is nothing but grievance. He needs Nick helpless because helplessness is the only mirror in which he can mistake himself for powerful. That realization could become crucial. It would not free Nick instantly. It would not erase the drugs, the pain, or the danger. But it would give him something invaluable, clarity. And clarity matters in places like this. It allows a man to stop viewing himself as prey and start understanding the mind of the predator. Once that happens, even the smallest act of resistance begins to carry new force. Still, clarity alone is not rescue. The danger remains immense. Matt has already crossed too many lines to retreat cleanly, and that makes him more volatile with every hour. The more resistance he senses from Nick, the harsher he may become. The more he fears outside interference, the more aggressively he may accelerate his plan. A man this invested in symbolic destruction is unlikely to accept losing control without doing even more damage on the way down. That raises the stakes for every possible next step. If help reaches Nick too late, the damage may be profound. If help reaches him at the wrong moment, Matt could lash out with catastrophic force. If Nick tries to force a confrontation before he is physically capable, he could provoke consequences his body cannot survive. Every possible path is lined with risk, and that is exactly the suffocating tension this story needs. By now, the emotional atmosphere surrounding Nick should feel almost unbearable, and that is why the plot works so well when pushed to its darkest logical edge. Matt is not just threatening a man, he is attacking the structure of a life. He is trying to make Nick doubt himself, distrust his own mind, fear his own weaknesses, and become a source of pain to the people who care about him. In response, Nick is being forced into the most intimate and painful kind of heroism, the kind no one sees in real time, the kind that happens in silence, in confusion, in the lonely decision not to let go of oneself, even when the world seems determined to pull that self apart. This is where the story stops being about plot mechanics and becomes about spiritual endurance. And when the moment of reckoning finally comes, it should not feel clean. It should feel raw, costly, and emotionally unfinished. Because even if Nick survives, even if Matt is exposed, even if the immediate threat is stopped, the damage will not simply evaporate. Nick would have to live with what was done to him. He would have to rebuild trust in his own body, his own judgment, his own emotional stability. He would have to process the shame of having been targeted so personally, the rage of knowing how close he came to destruction, and the grief of understanding that survival itself can come with scars no one else fully sees. That aftermath is important because it preserves the seriousness of the ordeal. Matt's cruelty should not vanish with one act of rescue. It should linger. It should challenge Nick in new ways. It should force other characters to respond not with simplistic comfort, but with the difficult, imperfect labor of helping someone live after being nearly erased. Until then, the story remains locked in its most frightening phase. Matt is pressing forward with a revenge plan that grows more vicious the deeper it goes. Nick is fighting not only against physical collapse, but against spiritual disintegration. The people connected to him are moving ever closer to a point where fear will become action, and action may ignite even more chaos. This is not ordinary danger. This is the kind of danger that stains everything it touches. And that is exactly why it feels so gripping. Because the struggle now is not just over whether Nick can be saved. It is over whether he can be saved without losing the very parts of himself that made him worth saving in the first place.